Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and one of the State of Israel's most important allies has consistently been the Congress of the United States, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. You'll often hear how crucial bipartisan congressional support has been in maintaining the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And on the one hand, this bipartisan congressional support simply reflects the will of the American people, who are represented by members of Congress. But it's still very important that members of the House and Senate remain as proactively supportive of Israel as possible, advancing legislation that ensures the American government maintains the strong bonds that provide Israel with U.S. financial support, especially as it applies to military funding for such Israeli defense instruments as the Iron Dome, and in the area of intelligence sharing between the two countries. And we Americans and American Jews, we all understand that Israel, as a free, democratic nation, must be able to protect its own people and care for its own needs on its own. And one should never forget or minimize the fact that Israel has never once asked Americans to shed blood on Israeli soil. No American soldier has had to fight in defense of Israel or to shed blood for the State of Israel. America has troops stationed all over the world in harm's way. America has no troops in harm's way in Israel. And yet at the same time, as much as Israel must be able to sustain itself and defend itself, and the bottom line, rely on itself for its security needs, the truth is that in this complex world in which we live, and with the explosion of anti-Semitism throughout Europe and in much of the Arab world, and even in third world countries that they have no Jews at all living there, and there's still anti-Semitism. In the context of our world, Israel needs the United States, needs U.S. support, and U.S. intelligence and U.S. military hardware in the form of U.S. financial assistance, and in the international war that we're fighting against the BDS movement, which seeks not only to delegitimize the State of Israel, but seeks to eradicate the State of Israel from the face of this earth. In this reality, Israel also needs U.S. diplomatic assistance in the UN General Assembly and in a host of UN committees. Israel needs the United States to protect Israel from UN sanctions and condemnations and votes, which could be terribly detrimental to Israel's well-being. And there has been consistently, there's been one U.S. stalwart defending Israel and ensuring America truly has Israel's back, and that is the United States Congress. And so whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether a senator or a congressman is a Republican or a Democrat, when it comes to the State of Israel, party doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the content of a congressman's embrace of the State of Israel, a senator or congressman's voting record on matters pertaining to the State of Israel. And so on this edition of L'Chaim, I am honored to be joined by a member of Congress from the great state of North Carolina, Republican Congressman Mark Meadows, who's become one of Israel's most ardent and loyal supporters in the House of Representatives. And Congressman, it is such a what a kick for me to have you sitting at this table. We've had a chance to talk a little bit already. You're a lovely, lovely person, and it is an honor to have you sitting at this table. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Mark, the pleasure is all mine, and as you started out, so many of those things that you were talking about just line up with where I'm at. But you're right. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is an issue of the heart, and where we need to make sure that we stand up is being unflinching in our support of Israel.
There's so much I want to know about in terms of who you are and what you are, and then I want to talk to you about how you view Israel. You were not born in the United States. What's your story, Mark?
Yeah,
By the way, we should let the audience know, the congressman has asked me to call him Mark, so I'm not being disrespectful. Mark, where were you born and what's the story?
I was born in Verdun, France, so you're right, not here in the United States. My dad was in the Army. My mother went over to be with him. She was a nurse, and so that time came that was appointed for me to be born, and so there I actually was born in France. But really, the United States is what I've known all my life.
But how long did you live in France?
You know, just a short period.
Okay, so
for really not more than a year.
Okay, so it's an interesting factoid, but it is not relevant in terms of who you are.
Not in terms of who I am.
Okay.
And so grew up primarily in Florida, and so.
And you went to college in Florida?
I went to college in Florida and ended up with my wife of 35 years in North Carolina. We went to North Carolina on our honeymoon.
Wait a minute, have you been married 35 years?
I have.
Your wife is gorgeous. You're gorgeous.
I'm married well above my station in life. Yeah.
Well, you also must have married very, very young, Mark. But how many children?
We have 2 children. I have a daughter who actually her first day of work in Atlanta, Georgia is today. Just graduated from college.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And
what will she be doing?
She's actually working for a global communications and consulting company, Aon Consulting, and so they do benefits globally, a good company. My son is in law school at Emory Law School in Atlanta. So,
very, very nice. Were you in business before you went into politics?
I was a business guy all my life.
What did you do?
And so we did real estate, did some restaurants, primarily development and real estate work, and so was a business guy.
And then at some moment in life, you decide, you and your wife, it's got to be a joint decision, that you and your wife are going to go into American politics. And by the way, we should let the audience know, as we're taping, you're in your second term as North Carolina Congressman from the 11th District of North Carolina. But what prompts you, Mark, to do this?
You know, a concern about our country, a concern about our world. When we look at the meltdown internationally that I'm sure we'll be talking about today, that was a big part of it. But it was really a concern for my fellow man. And so I left a very comfortable lifestyle to run for office, really the first foray into federal politics, and was fortunate enough to be elected. And
this is your first public office, Congressman?
It is.
That's very impressive,
and
Mark.
So we've, but you know, when you care about people, you have a business background, and you're not afraid to speak the truth, good things happen.
Okay. Just so some of our audience may know, the 11th District covers what area of North Carolina?
The western part of North Carolina, most of your viewers would know it as the Asheville, North Carolina. That's the biggest city, but it's 17 counties in the west, 5 hours from one end to the other, and it's a great, beautiful place in North Carolina.
Okay. So on the one hand, Mark, my sense of you immediately was you're a very lovely guy. At the same time, this is not about you personally, but I want you to understand what I'm about to say. You know, it may even be something that you would have said before you entered politics. Mm-hmm. The problem people have at the moment is that we tend to be suspicious of those who are in government. Mm-hmm. And again, the audience should know we've had a little bit of time to talk beforehand. I sense you are something of a romantic and an idealist. And the question for me is, Was this always true of, if I was talking to your wife right now who's in the control room, would she say, yeah, that's who Mark is, as opposed to it is a persona that a congressman, an elected official, adopts because what you don't want to do is project cynicism. But the problem that Congress faces at the moment is that the American people are very cynical of all politicians. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. And there is a cynicism that basically you're in it in some way for yourself, and that the sense of I want to help people is a line we hear does not reflect some basic truth deep inside you. Now, in some way, what can you say to this question? But at the same time, you know what I'm saying to you. And I'm asking you, if I had talked to you 5 years ago, 7 years ago, when your kids are just entering college or are struggling through high school, and you haven't made it yet the way you ultimately do, and you and your wife are looking at policy on television and reading the newspaper, and you have your own complaints about what's going on in Washington, I want you to be as honest as you can be with me, describing how you view the political scene before you got there, and then how do you see yourself now, Mark, fitting in or not fitting in?
That's a very good analysis, and I think you're right. The listeners, they're wanting, whether it's Republican or Democrat, somebody to be different. When you look at the approval rating of Congress, most across the board would be approved at an 8% level. Well, a cockroach is at 9%, so that gives you a perspective of where it is. But I think really the biggest part for me, Mark, is that we've got to find a way to bridge that gap and to be truthful. And for me, coming from North Carolina, a passion for Israel and for fighting anti-Semitism is really something that Debbie and I, every morning we wake up and say, well, what will we do for Israel today? Now, to put that in perspective, that doesn't necessarily get me a lot of votes back in Western North Carolina. If I was sharing with a friend earlier, when you look at the number of synagogues in Western North Carolina, it is not like you would find it on a map. So it has to be heartfelt, and you have to be different. But I think the other part of that is that you have to be consistent, and that's where you're getting it. Politicians let people down. They've let me down. It's one of the reasons why we ran, and I say we because you're right, it is a family thing. It's not like it can be just me or just me and my wife. Our entire family had to embrace it because you're put under a spotlight that every word that you say is dissected, critiqued, and evaluated. But with that, Mark, I think the bigger problem is people want to believe in their government. They want that trust restored, and we only do that one building block at a time. So for me, it's about rebuilding that wall that's right in front of me. I can't worry about what's to my right or my left. If I can rebuild that and build that trust back on a solid foundation, hopefully one day he says, I don't know that I totally trust him, but I trust him more than I did a year or two ago.
That's a lovely answer. I appreciate it. By the way, I should have asked you, what is your own religious background?
I think that a number of you would call me an evangelical, and that term actually is one that I learned from some of my Jewish friends and so my love for Israel comes from that faith. But yet at the same time, for me, it's really about trying to make sure that, and the reason I'm here in New York is to learn from people one-on-one, one person at a time, to help me understand more than I already do the culture and the heritage that is uniquely Jewish and really is something that needs to be preserved. And for us, serving on the Middle East subcommittee is something that I asked for when I came. That's normally not a good fundraising committee that you get on. And yet it was all about that passion.
I want to ask you one more question about ideology, because it
Sure.
begins to bring us to the issues that pertain specifically to the Jewish people in the state of Israel. And I want to frame it as crudely, Mark, as I can. You will excuse me for doing that.
Please.
Okay. The Jewish community has traditionally voted Democrat. There are those who are surprised that there was such an overwhelming vote for President Obama the second time, after there were some concerns that he had in some way done some damage, if not in any real policy, in an atmosphere. And atmosphere is very important. One of the things I believe a president does is he sets a tone.
Sure.
Much of the legislation is coming out of the Congress, but the president sets a tone. And again, I don't know. Again, I'm older than you are. For me, I lived through the Kennedy years. And what Kennedy did was change the tone of this country, and there was just an idealism that swept through the country. It got, it was expressed not only in the words of his first inaugural, but also in the Peace Corps. And it was a tragedy. And there may have been a much more complicated reality behind Kennedy, but what Kennedy did for us in the early 60s was make us believe again in the idealism of the United States. One of the criticisms of the president from the Jewish community, Democrat and Republican, is that he has done some damage to the tone of the Israeli-American relationship, and that he has been unrealistically reaching out, and that everybody wants to embrace the entire world, including the Muslim world. But you can't be unrealistic in the way you do it. And so there are people who are surprised that the Jewish community voted virtually as much in the second term as he did first term, despite the fact that there were real issues between Israel and the Obama administration. I will say to you parenthetically, Mark, if you don't know this, you're learning it today. If you know it, I'm telling you something you know. The vast percentage of American Jews are not committed to the state of Israel. They are not. It doesn't mean they're anti-Israel. But the group that we spoke about before we went on camera, the Jerusalem Post Conference, the Jerusalem Post Conference had a slice of American Jewish life, Democrat and Republican, that is not representative of the Jewish community of America as a whole. So when people say, how can it be that more than 70% voted for Obama the first time and almost the same percentage voted for him the second time after the Israel issue, it's because most American Jews, that's not what their focus is. There's a slice of American Jewry, a large slice, which cares passionately, and that's why the work you're doing is so important. At the same time, there is a commitment to a certain sense of social justice that is across the Jewish spectrum in the American community. And that the criticism that's leveled by American Jewish Democrats is that the Republican Party does not care enough on social issues, setting Israel aside, on social issues, on women's issues, on the issues of the poor and the minorities, that somehow the Democratic Party is more sensitive to the day-to-day people's needs and of not even the underclass, but the vast middle class, which continues to be separated more and more in the economic spectrum of the American community. And I'm asking you, there would be Jewish Democrats who actually are self-righteously critical of Republicans for not caring enough. And my long preamble is to give you an opportunity to address the issue. Do you, as a Republican congressman, feel that the Republican Party, whether it's Tea Party, hard right within the conservative wing of the Republican Party, or even whatever moderate Republican Party exists, do you feel that the criticism that you, as a Republican, are less sensitive to the needs of the average people, that you don't care as much about people as Democrats? How would you answer that?
Mark, you've put that in a context that is undeniable. I mean, when you really look at many of the voters that look at the issue, It's putting it in a box that says, okay, well, this is how Republicans are, this is how Democrats are. We know that there's a spectrum across that. Being someone who grew up with real humble beginnings, where I didn't come from a family of influence or of money, getting to live below the poverty line longer than I lived above it. It's one of those things that heart that we talked about earlier really is something that we have to really focus on. I had a conversation last night with a rabbi that we were talking about this very issue, and he was candid. He said, do you care about the education? Do you care about helping the poor? And the Republicans have done a very poor job of articulating that and showing that. Much of the time, it's more of a tactical. It's saying, how are we going to fix it? Do we say, does more money fix it, or does philanthropic nonprofits do a better job of that? And I'll give you a prime example. In Washington, D.C., there's this argument right now in the education side of things where I'm advocating on behalf of giving additional scholarships to underprivileged that are in the schools there. Now, there's this battle with regards to the teachers' unions and public school and for me, it was affecting. I watched a documentary, Waiting for Superman, that talked about the school system and the lottery system with charter schools. Some of it based here in New York. I wept tears as I saw young children and moms and dads struggling to give their children a way to advance and get out of poverty. We've got to find a way, just like we're talking about some of these other areas, in a bipartisan way to look at it. And I think if we can take our norms of the tactical, whether it be a Democrat tactic or a Republican tactic, and say, okay, how can we work together to find something that addresses those concerns, while at the same time not taking it away. The government's never going to be as compassionate as a church or a synagogue or many of your viewers who give philanthropically, very generously to these causes because it's their passion. So how do we come alongside and team up with them to make sure that their dollar goes further, to make sure that we address that? And for me, that's that sweet spot that I'm looking for. If I forget where I came from and that humble beginnings, my compassion starts to lessen. And that's the danger that we have, whether we're talking about a love for Israel or whether we're talking about a love for the poor or education or healthcare, whatever it may be. We've got to find that way to work together, and it's tough because when you start looking at it, you go against all the norms, whether they be party norms or whether they be philosophical norms or ideological norms. But I do believe that there is a real desire. Education is one of my big things. And so I have been in over 40 schools back in North Carolina. And you don't get votes generally by going to schools. They don't vote. But I go in and just embrace the kids and have a great time, answer all kinds of political questions. And so you'll get them they ask some of the best questions, Mark. But if we look at that and we try to find a way to chip away and say, okay, well, maybe we'll move a little bit here and a little bit there to solve this, I think that's where we need to be. And so for your listeners that are out there, I've got a good friend, Gladys Rothbaum, who has always said, Mark, we just need to keep an open mind. And so it's finding that truth where we can hopefully meet the needs of those in our neighborhood. It's the reason I ran.
I appreciate your answer very, very much. One day I would love to have you here just to talk about the political scene, maybe you and some other guest as well, and we would just let the two of you talk and we would get to hear it. But I appreciate your letting me just push you a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so what's so interesting about you is it's not only do children not tend to vote? Is there a huge Jewish population in the 11th District of North Carolina?
No, there's not.
Okay. So from whence your own personal commitment and affection for the state of Israel?
Part of it comes from my faith that I talked about earlier, but the other part really looks at history. And if we are not willing to speak up, if we're willing to be silent in the face of great injustice, we're repeating a mistake that history has shown us is that horrific, the results. And if you don't mind, I'd love to share just a real brief story.
Please.
I was in Budapest, Hungary, and my wife and I were there. We were there, and anywhere we go, we talk about anti-Semitism and how do we fight it. In Hungary, it is a big issue. Many of their politicians are very concerned about the rise of that. But along the Danube there on the seawall is a memorial of hundreds of shoes, of bronze shoes now that are bronze. But the story was back that, Hitler would come in and they would, in order to not waste bullets, they would tie 3 people together. They would shoot the 2 on the ends and tie the one in the middle, and they would throw them overboard, and they would keep their shoes because that was the most valuable part of it. We went to visit that memorial. The tears flowed. We ended up there with some Jewish visitors that came from New York and New Jersey and Maryland. It was a very touching time for me. But we have got to get to a place again and never forget the lessons of the past. But we also need to make sure that the most valuable thing about a Jewish life is not their shoes. And if we do not speak up, I'm afraid that we get to the possibility of that once again being the case. And we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe that we haven't seen since Nazi Germany. So we've got to speak boldly, and whether it sends me back to Congress or not, we're going to speak out on that particular issue and make sure that it gets addressed.
That's a courageous thing to say, Mark. I give you credit for it. When is the first time you went to Israel?
My wife and I went just a couple of days after the ceasefire in 2012. We paid our own way. We went there. It was life-changing.
This is before you became a congressman.
Before I became a congressman, we went. Actually, I had been elected. I was going before I was sworn in. We went to the intelligence group and the security folks. They went, "Oh my goodness, you're going," and they were all concerned. But we went, and it was truly life-changing. It not only brought the enormity of the issue. I didn't realize how small Israel as a country is until you're there. But I think the other thing is, for me, it gave me a passion to want to come back, and so we've been twice. We'll be going back our 3rd time in October. And it really is all about trying to make sure that we understand what we're advocating on behalf.
So now tell me about how you view the Iranian deal, the Iranian framework, and the suggestion that the P5+1 and the Obama administration have a certain vision, which we understood the intent had been to prevent Iran from ever, I underline the word ever, from ever gaining a nuclear weapon. Not that we're going to postpone it 3, 5, 10, or 12 years, but that the American administration's initial goal was that Iran would never become a nuclear weaponized state. Mark, most American Jews, I think most Americans, now look at the framework that Secretary Kerry has championed and that Barack Obama continues to champion and to speak about wherever he goes. It looks to many of us as if a compromise has been made, and that what the president now is saying is that, although he says one thing to Thomas Friedman in a White House interview, New York Times White House interview, that basically what has happened is we're looking to postpone the time it will take Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But it doesn't look to many of us as if the basic overwhelming goal, which was to prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, it looks to us like that has been lost. Now that's the lay perspective. You're in Congress, and I want to say, as a footnote to this, you're a Republican. It's always hard to know whether a Republican criticism of an American president and administration policy is driven by partisan politics, or were there a Republican in the White House right now who did the very same thing that the president has done? What would your reaction be? And I just want you to be aware that the audience isn't stupid, that you have to make sure we understand the extent to which you're not bashing a Democratic president. I want to know what you, and by the way, the reason I set it up this way, I know some of the things that Mark Meadows has done in Congress. He has been one of the staunchest advocates of a strong anti-Iranian policy. I want him to describe it, but at the same time, I want you also to separate for us, as you do, where is it, you know, you're against the Democratic president as opposed to this being a matter of principle. So now I've set it up. Talk to me about how you view the Iranian deal.
Well, Mark, that's well said, and it would be disingenuous to suggest that someone of my party would be as critical of someone in the White House.
Good for you. Very fair.
It's just, you know.
Fine.
However, what I have tried to do is keep my criticism of the policy and less of the president. And recognizing, and for a long time I kept very quiet because negotiations are tough. Anytime you negotiate, you got a number of different factors that are coming in order to get a good deal. You have to give some flexibility. You mentioned the framework. Secretary Kerry puts out this framework. Most people don't realize there's not a written framework. There is no written framework. The best we have with a framework has been published in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. So if you went to look for a document, there is no document. That being said, I think the thing that scares me the most is that our rhetoric, and you mentioned this starting out, has changed from zero tolerance to a deferment of having this Iranian nuclear capability. And that's just not acceptable. It's not acceptable to Israel. It's not acceptable to the United States. It shouldn't be acceptable. Now, today, we're here taping this. We're not afraid of rockets coming in. And so we live in a pretty safe environment, even being so close to where 9/11 happened. But yet, when we look at this, what we've got to do is understand that we've taken the negotiations for ICBMs off the table. I mean, there's only one reason why the Iranian regime would want ICBMs, and that's to deliver a nuclear weapon here. They've already got the capability for Israel. And yet we take that off. And
why? Why was it taken off the table?
It shouldn't have been. I mean,
what's the explanation given to you as a member of Congress?
Without sharing anything classified, I can share in a context is that some deal is better than no deal. I disagree with that. A bad deal is bad for Israel. It's bad for the United States. It's bad for American Jews. It's bad for Israeli Jews. It's bad for American Gentiles. It's bad. And so what happens there, Mark, is that we've got to really focus on the fact that allow the president to have a way to walk away and not consider it a failure. And for me, I will applaud him more from walking away from this particular deal because it's changed. First we were going to have military inspections. Fordo was going to go away. We were going to not allow centrifuges of this particular type to stay there. Well, it's all there. And if you look at what we did with Korea, we're going down the same path. And the example of Korea is that they have not only the ability, but they have a number of nuclear bombs that are available for deployment, and yet here we are today about to make the same mistake with a regime that hates America. You know, is chanting as recent as yesterday, "Death to America," and so it to me should be troubling for all Americans. Many Americans across the country don't pay attention to it because they're there looking at and thinking, well, we live in a safe environment, it's not a big deal, we can contain it. But we're about to embark in the next few days on a path that will have, I believe, tragic consequences.
Okay. What are the tragic consequences?
I think they're twofold. One is whether the deployment of those the nuclear capability would come directly at Israel or the United States is a real threat. But the other thing that we start to see is once they get the capability, or at least are on the path, even the path to the capability, they become more bold in the region. We've already seen that with regards to Yemen and taking over of shipments, and you start to see an escalation with Saudi Arabia. They're there just waiting for a delivery from Pakistan of a nuclear device as well, if that happens. So we see, Israel is in a tough neighborhood, but what we're about to do is let a real proliferation of offensive weapons to happen in the Middle East, and it's troubling. And so it's on two fronts. One is the actual deployment, but the other is the unstable, the support of terrorism in the region. And so it's in those two different buckets, Mark.
You are not on an intelligence committee, are you?
We're not. I'm on the Middle East subcommittee.
Correct. Okay.
And go to classified briefings on a weekly or biweekly basis.
So, tell me what you do or do not know. You may not simply know this, or you may know and not be able to tell me. We hear that Iran is a chief sponsor of international terrorism. How do we know?
Well, we do know from an intelligence standpoint. The Department of Treasury is under one of my subcommittees.
You don't doubt this at all?
But I'm 100% confident. And I'm not 100% confident about much of anything, but on this particular thing, you mentioned South America. Really, when you look at Hezbollah, look at Hezbollah, they're trafficking at times more drugs than some of the cartels. I was in Colombia in the jungles, flew in on Black Hawk helicopters to look at this very issue. And when you look at terrorist organizations, primarily Hezbollah, in that particular region. But it's not just there. It's in Canada. It's in the United States. It's in my home state, Hezbollah. They're everywhere. If you
Hezbollah, drug trafficking is in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, drug and tobacco trafficking in North Carolina. You can Google it.
You don't literally mean they're Hezbollah members. You believe that somehow the tentacles of their...
Both. I mean, when you look at it, if you go, you can Google with regards to our U.S. attorney in Charlotte. There was all kinds of, they tried to kill off some of the judges and blow up different things. And that's in North Carolina. I mean, so if it's happening in North Carolina, the chances of it happening throughout every major state.
New York.
Sure. I mean,
Chicago. Boston.
It would be more prolific here.
Right. Okay. Then I say to myself, again, I understand there's a balancing act. There's something called realpolitik, and you can't just pretend things away. And sometimes a government must make alliances, even with governments that they don't like.
Right.
And it's naive to think you can only be in alliances with good governments. But Iran seems to be the seat of so much of the, for lack of a better word, evil of the world, so much of the terrorism in the world, that I don't understand the administration's perspective. And it's not simply the American administration. There are those in America who believe this is the way you build bridges even with your enemies. Nixon goes to China as if that's a model here. It's not a model here. Right. But there is something philosophically that we understand. You must deal with your enemy. One of the things you hear the Israelis say is, Abba Eban sat on L'chaim years ago and said, before anybody was saying, of course Israel has to dialogue with the PLO. You have to. And again, Abba Eban had the stature to be able to say it and get away with it.
Right.
At the same time, I say to myself, if Iran is really the sponsor of Hezbollah and of Hamas and then of Al-Qaeda and of terrorism throughout the world, what in the world is America doing making deals with Iran as if we're going to somehow win them over? What is the thinking there, Mark?
I don't know what the thinking is. We're not going to win them over. I think everybody, many of your viewers are sitting there saying, well, I'm a reasonable person. They look at themselves, they look in the mirror and they said, oh, this is a reasonable person staring back. And that many times is true. Yet at the same time, when we start to go to move this regime that is sponsoring terrorism, whether it be Hamas or Hezbollah, and we're not talking about just a few million. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars each and every year that's going in to create havoc in a number of other places. We say that we wouldn't negotiate with terrorists. Well, we're negotiating with terrorists.
Of course.
And the power of walking away from the table has consequences, without a doubt. No one wants to go to war. I don't want to go to war. You don't want to go to war. And yet, at the same time, if we end up establishing a relationship with a regime that does not honor its commitments, it hadn't even honored its commitments to the UN. They're violating UN sanctions currently, and yet we somehow turn a blind eye to that and think that they're going to be different in this new deal. I, for one, do not see that. I've had a number of opportunities to deal with some of the highest officials within the Iranian government, and I see that this path that we're on is extremely dangerous for the United States and for Israel.
Mm-hmm. At one point, it seemed as if international sanctions, which at one point did involve Russia, China, that they were working. They brought Iran to the negotiating table. And that for the life of me, I do not understand why the decision was made to lift certain sanctions as a reward for their coming to the table, because this idea of snapback seems to be wildly unrealistic to me. Once you remove the sanctions, and once now certainly Russia and or China have other interests vis-a-vis Iran, to ever get back to that point seems to me to be wildly unrealistic. I don't understand how the administration, I'm not going to personalize it, how the administration can say with a straight face to the American people, we'll keep snapback sanctions in place and we will snap them back if we find out Iran is cheating or isn't keeping. And but everybody tells me, and again, I have to believe what people tell me, I have no proof myself, that Iran has not kept any of its prior agreements, responsibilities, promises. Why would we assume they would do this now? That ultimately ultimately it is now the best policy would be to assume that you can't trust Iran and that you must force Iran not to go in certain directions, including the nuclear weapon. And they don't need the kind of enriched uranium for peaceful purposes. We know that. The world knows that. So why are we engaging in a certain kind of self-deception here? So that for me, the removal of the sanctions and now the inability to place them back sanctions were the alternative. The president says, well, what's the alternative? It's either this deal or no deal. Well, there was an alternative in place. It was called sanctions that were crippling Iran. Yes, they had not shut down their centrifuges, but they were going nowhere with them.
Right.
So, I don't know. I'm just giving you a layman's reaction. It is not partisan one way or the other. All I know is I wanted Iran never to get a nuclear weapon. It seems to me now that the president and the administration is saying we will delay it. And again, I guess I'm coming back to that question. As you view it, you're a member of Congress. You have introduced or co-sponsored legislation to force the president to involve Congress in the process, that the president cannot simply go off and make a deal of his own, which was the original intent, which he has now backed down on to a large degree because of congressmen like you. But, okay, again, give me now your general sense of this.
Well, you may say you're a layman, Mark, but I can tell you that that's an informed analysis. When you really look at the snapback, you can take a number of hearings that I've been in. You can have from very informed people that are in the know. The ability to snap back is not going to happen for two reasons. One is the U.S. sanctions are only a small part of it. The international sanctions that were really UN directed, once those go away, the chances of getting those back, we may be able to snap back our sanctions, but that's a very small piece of the pie. The other aspect that you talk about, though, is when we look at that, we started in saying, well, we're going to try to trust this regime. And we're going to take some pressure off. I can tell you it was working. I had talked to a number of people in their government. You know, they said, well, it's not really working, but at the same time, will you please take them off? I mean, so I really think that, you know, your viewers, one of the key things for them to do is there's a real boldness on behalf of some Democrats who are willing to speak out on this. And so I would encourage them to call and really get behind some of those Democrats because it's tough. I mean, I told you, I mean, if it were a different party in the White House, and for me to go against my party, you get criticized by some of your colleagues. And so I think it's just as critical to come back and say, one, the snapbacks are not real. That's not going to happen. And you mentioned the other thing. If there's a disagreement, in the framework is this whole mitigation time. And so if there's a disagreement, it doesn't automatically snap back. It goes to someone who's going to arbitrate or mitigate the differences. Well, the breakout time for Iran is 12 months. You could mitigate it for the whole time, and they would still have you know, the capability that we're fighting to make sure they don't have. So again, it gets back to how we started this out, is about having the truth and people being able to trust those elected officials. And so there's some folks that have been real bold, and I would encourage a lot of your viewers to call out and really say, this is important to us, not only in New York or across Los Angeles, wherever it may be, but it's important to all of America and certainly all of Israel.
What's going to happen, Mark?
I believe that we're going to miss the June 30th deadline. France is actually being stronger on this than the United States, which I would never have expected, but they're being stronger on this. I think we missed that deadline. It gets extended between 30 and 60 days while they work out a final deal. It will be put forth as we can verify, and we can make sure that it doesn't happen. And unfortunately, if I were to have to guess today, I think there are not going to be enough votes in Congress to override what I would consider is a potentially dangerous decision. I think we'll fall a few votes short, and yet, you know, the message that I don't want to be conveyed is a lack of hope. You know, one of the reasons why I'm here in New York is I want to encourage those who are fighting for these issues to know that there is a congressman from North Carolina that they may never have known about that's willing to fight on behalf of what is right and true, but I'm not alone. There are a number just like me on both Democrat and Republican side where we can hopefully work together in a teamwork. But we're going to see a Sunni Shia implosion within the Middle East, and our decisions on this particular deal will unfortunately help facilitate that.
Mm-hmm. Will Iran ultimately gain a nuclear weapon?
The rhetoric is changing from all those in the administration as well as others, and so when your rhetoric changes, you're never going to be any better than your rhetoric. And so the answer is yes. Ultimately, it will lead to that.
Good for you. Yeah. Good for you, Mark Meadows. I want to ask one more issue having to do with Israel.
Sure.
And from your perspective inside Congress. Why is there no peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians?
The Palestinian people are not willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And when you can't recognize the existence, not as Israel as a state, but as a Jewish state, I will say, and I'm trying, without putting the politics into this particular issue, there's a whole lot of narratives that are not necessarily accurate as it goes. When I was in Israel, there's no one who would love to live peacefully more than those people in Israel. I mean, there's simply no one.
Good for you. You are correct.
And I've been in the terror tunnels.
You are correct. Go ahead.
I've been in the terror tunnels where actually money that came from Israel was designed to help with schools and hospitals and all, and they came back in the forms of concrete walls and floors and lighting and tunnels that were with the sole purpose of coming up in a kibbutz so they could kill Israeli citizens. I found that just offensive, and yet here we are. It is imperative that we continue to make awareness, you speaking out, continuing to take that awareness so that the average American can understand what it's all about, because most of us don't. We read the headlines and say, boy, can't they just get along? Can't they get an agreement? And I would say from the far right in Israel to the far left in Israel, I think everybody wants to live peacefully. There's different components, as you know, of what makes a good deal. But if we don't continue to raise that awareness, I was with Ambassador Dermer it's been about 18 months ago, before the Gaza conflict. His phone kept going off, and he apologized. And he says, I'm sorry, we're under attack in Israel. It was reported nowhere. At that time, 42 missiles had gone into Israel. And I said, well, what's that on your phone? He said, well, it's an app called Red Alert that's on his phone. I said, well, I would love to have that on my phone and get it on all the members of Congress so we could be aware of it. He said, well, there's only one problem. It was in Hebrew. Now Hebrew is not a common language in North Carolina. And so I said I would be willing to help translate that. Well, working with Ambassador Dermer and many, we now have Red Alert in English.
That's right.
And it is a constant reminder. Rockets within the last couple of days going in, and we need to keep that awareness going for the American people.
Okay. You've heard me say some nice things to you. I mean every one of them. You are an extraordinary human being. That's number one. You're lovely and you're thoughtful. But you stand on the precipice of something very important. Right now you're representing the great state of North Carolina. You will do that as long as that is meaningful and they re-elect you. But if you ever have the opportunity, it may be that one day you will run for national office. And as you do, I hope the same sensitivity you have to people in general, to the needs of this country, and to the relationship between Israel and the United States as an unbreakable bond is one that will also guide you. I wish you, we say in Hebrew, kol tuv v'hatzlacha, only goodness and success in whatever you do. And I want you to promise me you'll come back here and sit at this table either alone or with somebody else, and we'll debate the issues as well going forward.
I would love that.
Would you?
I would love that.
Thank you.
Thank you, my
You're
friend.
very special. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
My meeting with Representative Mark Meadows. Remember the name, Republican Congressman representing North Carolina's 11th District. I hope you've enjoyed meeting him and hearing him and his perspective as much as I have. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything either Mark or I have said here on this edition of L'chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And if you want to be in touch with Congressman Meadows, you email me and I will forward your emails on to him, and he and his office will answer you. He is a remarkable representative of the United States of America in the United States Congress. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.